At the beginning of the story, one morning in the city of Denmark, there is a thin fog covering the office buildings, where the cold weather was increasingly felt piercing the skin. But the morning air didn't discourage people from doing their activities. Vehicles passed by without traffic jams. This was considered an anomaly, because usually Danish cities are always peppered with crimes and accidents, most of which are the work of a group of criminal syndicates. The atmosphere of the city that initially looked normal suddenly turned into chaos. When not far from the traffic light intersection, a black car with two men was seen, where they are planning a robbery mission at a private bank that is right on the front side of their car. One of them, a young man named Yasin, was ordered by the man beside him to get out immediately while handing over a gun. After getting out of the car, wearing a helmet to disguise his face, Yasin immediately walked quickly towards the bank. When Yasin is about to cross, suddenly there was a car crash incident right at the intersection, and it was utilized by Yasin by immediately entering the bank. He freely performed the action without even being noticed by everyone who was still focused on the car crash incident out there. With a motorcycle that had been prepared beforehand, Yasin quickly carried away a bag with the looted money. Unfortunately, the action was foiled by a police car that suddenly appeared after getting a report from the bank. Nervousness made Yasin lose control and fall off his motorcycle. Not wanting to be caught, he reluctantly decided to escape by running as hard as he could without ignoring the bag containing the money he had robbed. Meanwhile, elsewhere, we will be introduced to a heart specialist doctor named Zaid. Zaid is a relatively successful young doctor, where while dealing with problems related to the heart and blood vessels, Zaid has never once failed. His existence is considered a helper sent to save human lives. This is evident where Zaid has just finished performing heart surgery on a patient. Of course, this wasn't separated from the contribution of the medical team who had been helping him. In the evening, Zaid and his wife, Stein, they held a dinner together with their friends in their luxurious apartment. The dinner was a form of thanksgiving. Zaid and his wife are currently happy because soon they will welcome the birth of their first child. Amidst the laughter of gathering and enjoying each other's company, Zaid's face suddenly turned grim when he repeatedly found his cell phone ringing. But of course, Zaid seemed reluctant to answer the call. Realizing this, Stein asked Zaid to answer the call, but just as Zaid wanted to do so, the caller was suddenly right in front of their apartment door. It turned out that the caller was Yasin, Zaid's younger brother. Yasin came to see Zaid to borrow 1,000 krona from Zaid. Yasin was no choice to borrow money from Zaid because the bag containing the money he robbed this morning failed to hand over to his boss, the leader of a crime syndicate or gangster group. Yasin realized the consequences of his carelessness would trigger the gangster's anger if he didn't hand over the money immediately. But even though Yasin had tried to plead with his brother, Zaid still refused, because Zaid already knew how criminal Yasin's behavior was. Even though Zaid seemed to have the heart to treat his younger brother who was in need of help, he actually felt sorry for him. It was evident where there was obvious sadness from the look on his face that couldn't stem the feelings of guilt. Just for the sake of kindness, he tried to awaken his younger brother who was always making trouble. The next morning, while Zaid was in the operating room, one of the doctors who also worked at the hospital called Zaid to give bad news about Yasin. According to the patient's history data, Yasin was known to be in a critical condition due to the severe injuries he suffered. Zaid, who heard the news, was of course shocked. So at that moment, Zaid immediately left to see the condition of his brother. After an hour of waiting with his father, mother, and wife, Zaid was approached by the doctor who was treating Yasin, where the doctor in a weak voice informed him that Yasin might not survive due to bleeding on his brain. With an expression of confusion, sadness, and even regret mixed together, Zaid with trembling lips couldn't help but deliver this news to his family, where the mother couldn't help but cry, realizing that her youngest son had passed away forever. In the afternoon, Yasin's funeral ceremony was held. Family, relatives, and neighbors joined in the atmosphere of grief. The mother's tears broke out again watching her son being put to his final resting place. It made Zaid even more devastated, feeling guilty when he remembered his brother begging for help for the last time. After the funeral, Zaid was approached by a man named Torben. It should be noted that Torben is a retired karate coach, where he expressed his condolences for Yasin's departure and also congratulated Stein on her pregnancy. When he wanted to leave the funeral area, Zaid was so annoyed that he was forced to honk repeatedly when he saw a group of men who parked a car in the middle of the road. The next day, Zaid visited his parents' house, with the intention of comforting them so as not to drag on their grief after Yasin's departure. Zaid then sat next to his mother, where the mother shows old photos to remember the past of Zaid and Yasin. As Zaid entered his former room, there were memories of his teenage years. There were several medals he had won when he was a karate athlete. The death of his younger brother, which is still a mystery, makes Zaid curious about what really happened. So he tried to calm his mind for a moment by walking down the road to the car park. That's when a young man was seen following the steps from behind, where it turned out that the young man was Yasin's friend named Alex. Alex deliberately followed Zaid just to provide information that the late Yasin had worked for someone named Branko. Zaid's curiosity grew, so the next day Zaid visited the police station to ask about the progress of the Yasin death case. But a detective named Claus is the person assigned to handle the case. It was unfortunate that he couldn't provide any information about the developments behind Yasin's death, and that's when Zaid suggested that Claus investigate the activities of a group of young men who were seen hanging out not far from his parents' house. But Claus seemed reluctant to do so. Claus outright rejected the suggestion and could only say that they would do their best to find the perpetrators. After a few days since Yasin's death, Zaid seems unfocused in carrying out his activities, including his role as a doctor who has been dedicated to saving many human lives. Even his emotions seemed difficult to control. This was proved when he attended an art exhibition organized by one of his colleagues named Rafael. When Rafael left with a mysterious young man who picked him up in a car, Zaid, who was suspicious of the young man, did to Rafael by pushing him. The next day, Zaid visited his parents' house again. There he had an argument with his father. His father disagreed with Zaid's suggestion to entrust the case to the Danish police, while they were just immigrants from Iraq who would certainly be ignored and underestimated. The father's anger was ignited because he still could not accept Yasin's departure. So he took it out on Zaid, who was supposed to take care of helping his brother's problems, where it makes Zaid even worse and feel guilty. In the midst of guilt and disappointment mixed together, Zaid chose to leave his father, who was still ranting. And then Zaid entered the late Yasin's room to look for something that might be used as a clue. Inside the room, after Zaid unpacked the drawers and some clothes that were piled up, he found a cell phone that allegedly belonged to Yasin, and also a gun found by the mother. Without lingering, Zaid returned to the police station and of course to find out how far the police had come in the case of his brother's death. But how disappointed Zaid was when Detective Claus gave a convoluted explanation by saying that this investigation was in process, without giving an explanation of how and what efforts they had made. It was then that Zaid was certain that Claus and the other police officers hadn't taken any action. Zaid's frustration grew when Claus stated that Yasin was a young man who often committed crimes. In the evening, Zaid was brooding. He began to justify the words of his father, who had strongly condemned the indifference of the Danish government. It seemed that in the eyes of the law, justice belonged only to the rulers, who looked down on minorities like them. On the verge of frustration, Zaid decided to go out along the city streets and stopped in a dark alley that was very quiet. And that's when Zaid was reprimanded by a thug who was guarding right from behind. Zaid then approached him and asked the thug to meet Branko. And without refusal, the thug led Zaid down the stairs that were the access to the underground room. Right in the room, Branko, who was known to be a gangster and drug dealer, was Yasin's former boss. Arrogantly and a little rudely asked Zaid to immediately say what his want and purpose for coming there. Zaid said that he just wanted to know what happened to his brother. Suddenly, a punch landed right on his head that made Zaid fall to the floor. At gunpoint, Zaid finally chose to leave immediately. This left him even worse off and so frustrated that he dreamt of seeing Yasin being dragged away by a car. The next morning, Zaid woke up looking unwell, Stein, who realized her husband was not well, had asked her husband to leave the task to the police. But Zaid realized that the police and law enforcement officers could no longer be trusted. At that moment, he immediately visited the morgue at the hospital and asked an officer to show the autopsy results of his brother's body. With the help of hospital staff, several photos of Yasin's body were finally obtained, and Zaid was furious when he saw the photos, describing how brutal the perpetrators were when they took his brother's life. Zaid's eyes were seen turning cold, implied sadness, disappointment, and anger that was no longer unstoppable. The devil whispered into his mind and soul to plan something for justice. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a man named Semyon was seen. Semyon is the one who hired and ordered Yasin to rob the bank some time ago, as well as the owner and trainer at a boxing gym club. Not long after finishing training some athletes, Semyon was approached by Branko, who came just to make small talk about their illegal business. During the conversation, one of Semyon's men suddenly came and interrupted their conversation. Seeing that he was being presumptuous, Semyon slapped him across the face, and that's when it became clear that Semyon was a very cruel and brutal man. He hired his men to commit robberies, including the late Yasin. So when his men failed, he insisted on finding the money immediately, without caring about all kinds of reasons that have fatal consequences, as happened with Yasin's fate. Meanwhile, Zaid visits a workshop owned by a retired karate coach, Torben. Here it is known that Torben used to train Zaid, when Zaid was still focused on being a karate athlete. Zaid's arrival there turned out to be to ask Torben for help to train him again. But Torben, who heard the request, was confused, then asked what was behind Zaid's request. That's when Zaid told him about the impropriety behind Yasin's death, where the police did nothing, as if letting the perpetrators can go anywhere without being arrested. Although at first Torben forbade and strongly discouraged Zaid from doing such a desperate act. But in the end, Torben agreed and asked his fellow coach Lars to train Zaid under his supervision. Day after day, Zaid worked tirelessly and continued to train hard to maximize his abilities. Until in the middle of his training, he happened to cross paths with Alex. After talking and asking Alex to help him during training, Zaid eventually concluded that Alex was a well-mannered young man. So, to keep in touch, Zaid invited Alex to his house, introducing him to his wife and inviting him to have dinner together. Zaid and Alex eventually became closer, like friends with whom they could exchange ideas. Alex also revealed who Semyon really was, as well as informing him that Semyon would be attending a free fighting demonstration tomorrow night. Long story short, the next night, Alex invited Zaid to the free fighting event, which turned out to be located in an underground room. There Semyon was seen directing his fighters who were fighting in the ring, and that's when Alex approached Semyon and greeted him. Meanwhile, Zaid, who was standing nearby, tried to hold back his emotions when Semyon deliberately made fun of him. Not wanting to make a commotion, Alex was forced to take Zaid away from there. In the morning, Zaid arrived late to accompany Stein for a gynecological checkup. The doctor said that there was a slight problem with the position of the fetus, so the doctor recommended that Stein should have a cesarean surgery. Realizing his tardiness, Zaid apologized to his wife, but Stein was in fact very disappointed, knowing that her husband would carry out a plan that could threaten her life. Arriving at Torben's workshop, Alex, who had managed to break into Yasin's locked cell phone password. At that moment, he gave the cell phone to Zaid. When he opens the photo gallery on the phone, Zaid sees several photos of Yasin with Semyon, allegedly the day before the robbery and his death. Zaid, who was already burning with anger, decided to immediately take action to finish off the perpetrators. But before taking action, Torben puts a bulletproof vest on Zaid, while reminding him to always be alert to everything that might happen. Then he preparing his weapons and disguising his appearance. After that, without lingering, Zaid immediately rushed on his motorcycle, starting the action by visiting Branko's headquarters first. In there, Zaid could take down several Branko's men who were on guard. After that, Zaid quickly picked up the illegal items on the table and set them on fire, as if to send a warning message to Branko. Zaid then decided to call it a night. He chose to accompany his wife for dinner at a restaurant, While they were chatting, Semyon and his accomplice suddenly came inside. Seeing the movements of her husband, who seemed to be unfocused, made Stein feel very neglected. So she decided to go to the toilet just to reduce her frustration with her husband. At that moment, Semyon approached Zaid. Zaid, who saw him coming, reflexively took the dinner knife on the table to anticipate any possibilities that would happen. Feeling threatened by Semyon's words in the restaurant, of course it made Zaid feel uneasy. So when he saw his wife was asleep, he immediately rode his motorcycle back to the restaurant. Not long after waiting in the parking lot, he saw Semyon get out and get into the car. Zaid was also following him from behind. Not long after, Semyon's car was seen stopping at the side of the road. When the driver got out and entered a supermarket at that moment, Zaid got off his motorcycle and slowly approached Semyon, who was waiting in the car. And then Zaid shot him from outside the glass. Unfortunately, Zaid failed. This was, of course, sparked the gangster's anger and wrath. So Semyon gathered all his men and interrogated them. He suspected that one of his men had betrayed him and tried to kill him. Meanwhile, Zaid went to the hospital where he worked. He entered the pharmacy and injected epinephrine, or more commonly referred to as the adrenaline-inducing hormone, which makes the heart pump faster and increases blood circulation throughout the body. Semyon's words apparently offended one of his men named Joan. He didn't accept because he felt accused by Semyon, so there was an argument between them. In the middle of the argument, suddenly, they were all shocked when they heard a sound that sounded so very loud. The explosion turned out to come from their car, which exploded and caught fire. Seeing this, of course, made Semyon even more furious. Without even realizing that at that time, Zaid was passing by who had successfully carried out his act of terror. As if he hadn't done anything, Zaid also returned to the hospital and was asked to handle the operation of a patient who turned out to be one of Branko's men, who was slaughtered by Zaid at Branko's headquarters earlier. Coming out of the operating room, Zaid again injected epinephrine while receiving a phone call from his mother, where the mother asked to come to the house to accompany her. After injecting the epinephrine, Zaid walked back to his apartment first. That is, intending to say goodbye to his wife before visiting his parents' house. But when Zaid passed through an alley, he was suddenly approached by a group of young men who pretentiously forced him to hand over some money. His condition was experiencing an unstable emotional phase, plus he had just used adrenaline-triggering hormones. At that moment, Zaid went berserk. Luckily, Alex immediately came to break up the commotion, and it was he who realized Alex was in an uncontrollable condition. At that moment, Alex asked Zaid to leave immediately. Long story short, Zaid arrived at his apartment. There he was greeted by his wife, who was waiting for him. Stein began to get frustrated seeing Zaid's behavior, which was getting worse every day. Stein really realized the bad plan of revenge carried out by her husband, where she couldn't understand how Zaid seemed to not care about his own life, while he will soon become a father figure. Not caring about his wife's advice, Zaid, who was already ignited by the flames of anger, resentment, and hatred, at that moment he chose to leave his wife. As soon as he got the call from Alex, Zaid went to the location where Alex was. How shocked Zaid was to find Alex in a battered condition, which turned out to be Alex had just been beaten by Semyon and his men. After giving makeshift treatment and calling an ambulance, Zaid immediately left to hunt down Semyon. But on the way, he saw the fire devouring his apartment. At the same time, Semyon and his men came to Torben's workshop. Viciously, they beat Torben to a pulp, tied him to a chair, and poured gasoline all over him. Without a word of mercy, Semyon, who didn't have a shred of empathy, threw his cigarette away. At that moment, he threw out his cigarette and Torben was burned alive. Not long after, Zaid, who was asleep at the time, woke up when he heard sound. He woke up instantly when he heard his cell phone ringing, indicating that there was an incoming message. How shocked Zaid was when he opened the message. It turned out that Semyon sent a video recording of Torben burning, which of course made Zaid even more unable to hold back his emotions. At that moment, Zaid immediately went to the hospital and sneaked into the patient's room. That is in the room where the Branko's men surgery on yesterday to get information about Semyon's whereabouts. Not long after, there was a Chinese restaurant. Branko was seen who had just finished eating and was leaving for the car park. But without Branko realizing it, Zaid was wearing a mask and hoodie jacket that smothered him from behind. Zaid ordered him to get into the car and took him to Semyon's place. While on the way, Branko deliberately crashed his car into the road divider, until they both crashed into each other. Then Branko strangled him and Zaid could take a gun to shoot him. After Branko died, Zaid then tried to get out of the car while reaching into Branko's pocket and taking his cell phone to send a message to someone. Not long after, a reply message came in, where the person who sent the message who directed Zaid to enter the location of an apartment. A moment later, the elevator stopped right on the 9th floor. Zaid slowly got out and could knock over one of the men who was guarding the corridor. Then he broke down one of the apartment doors, hobbling along while enduring the pain in his ribs. Without realizing it, Semyon suddenly appeared and hit his head from behind. The punches, kicks, and even slams he received were relentless. Zaid repeatedly tried to get up and was knocked down again without being able to fight back. However, when he remembered the late Yasin and Torben, who were also victims of Semyon's atrocities, Zaid, with his frail body, tried to stand up again. In the end, Zaid kicked Semyon until he fell from above. There was an instant silence, and the faint sound of Zaid's deep breathing indicated that he was satisfied with what he had done. However, suddenly his men fired randomly and Zaid could shoot him in the stomach. Zaid then took Semyon's men to the hospital. One of the nurses told him that his wife had just given birth. The nurse kindly told him to enter through the tunnel and gave him his access card so that he could enter to see his wife without being seen by others. From outside the delivery room, Zaid saw his wife holding their baby. Until without realizing it, tears fell down his cheeks. Zaid felt both happy and guilty for not being able to accompany his wife, feeling that he had no responsibility. Until Zaid just realized that what he had done was still unable to return the younger brother who was now gone. Zaid then left his wife feeling guilty. Zaid walked out down the corridor. Then without a fight, he surrendered himself when Claus and the police were waiting for him outside. After that, the movie ended.